All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Another church history lecture. I appreciate you continuing to be here. It's a blessing to me. I just thank you so much. Let's start with a prayer and then we'll get into the lecture. Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much. Thank you for this Thanksgiving holiday, this season that you have brought us through. Thank you for the times that we've had with our family and our friends and just in fellowship. Thank you so much for being in the center of all that we do and everything that we celebrate. I ask you to be with us here tonight. I ask you to just be with us, to teach us, to help us learn, to help us understand, to clarify things so that we understand where we came from, Lord, and what you've done with all of this history. Lord, I thank you for each one who's here. I ask that you be with them in their study times, Lord, that you open their minds, that you give them favor, Lord, that you would just allow them to continue to learn and be excited about your history. And we ask it all in your name. Amen. All right, so tonight, this first part of the lecture is really more informational. I might ask questions about Hildebrand, but this is sort of like adhesive more than it is fact that I want to make sure that you know and understand and can reiterate back to me. This whole feudal system is difficult. I took most of what I have here directly out of your book because it's in my personal opinion, it's difficult to understand the inner workings of the whole thing. So much of it is individualistic that it's sometimes the definitions, the lines of definitions are a little bit blurred. But I want you to understand this because as you move forward in your book for a little while, or even in other things that you read, you'll hear these terms, the fief, you'll hear a lot, at least if you're studying or reading about the Middle Ages. The Lord, sometimes they have different names, but in general, these are the easiest to remember, I guess. I just wanted to put it into a little bit of a perspective so that you could understand the very, very basics of how it works and how that government system led into and helped contribute to what was already happening within the church. So this is definitely adhesion more than it is make sure you know everything about what I'm about to tell you, okay? So this feudal system, it had three elements within this system. These two are very tangible. This one is not so tangible. Okay? So basically you have an overseer, or what they call a lord, and then you have, which normally, this is the person who's making decisions, the person who is, if you have a question, this is the person you would go to get an answer. Oftentimes, these individuals were wealthy people or people of some sort of power. A lot of times those things go together anyway. So people like kings and wealthy individuals like barons, those kinds of titles, men in those kinds of positions were normally given authority by this, by this governmental, this sort of, in my opinion, kind of in the ether governmental element, because the feudal system in general, it's not like a governing party that's federal or state that's overseeing a local something that's happening. It's really just a little tiny local government of individuals within itself. It's very much self-run. And so it's not like people are elected or you're dragged out of the woods like little Gregory was, or whatever. It's not, it's a position that somebody would want because they like the power. And then these five positions are positions these are normally people who needed some sort of protection. So remember at this time in the Middle Ages, lots of encroaching was happening. Lots of what they call the Germanic tribes, which we'll go into just a little bit in just a minute. All of these different people groups were starting to settle closer and closer and closer and starting to, for lack of a better term, invade in. Sometimes they were actual invasions and sometimes they were just So do you remember reading or hearing the story about whenever the Israelites settled in Egypt and they were blessed? That's when Joseph was in power. He was the second in command for all of Egypt, and he brought his family in. There was a great famine and all this stuff. He brought his family in, brought lots of Israelites in, and they ended up, over the years, over hundreds of years, they ended up just multiplying and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This was not by any stretch an invading group, right? But they got bigger and bigger and bigger, and at the end of the day, the Egyptians were like, we've got more Israelites around here than we know what to do with. I mean, so they were enslaving them, they were using them, they were this, but they were still being blessed, and they were still getting bigger and bigger, and they were still a threat all of a sudden. So even for those tribes that were not necessarily coming in like the Huns, coming in to take over and invade and do whatever it is they did, sometimes it was just people migrating in and the population's beginning to grow. Like, lots of people coming in, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be violent or negative, but it's still scary whenever you're in a place and you just don't understand what's happening, and a whole different people group come in, especially whenever other people groups really are threatening. It's just an uneasy time. So the bishops and the popes, the leaders of the church, they had a lot of authority. I mean, lots of things had happened through the previous years, and they had gained a lot of authority for good reason many times, but they had gained a lot of authority. But they were not necessarily militaristic. They weren't ready to defend themselves from, like what I mentioned last week, when the Lombards came in and they actually took over that area that's in Italy, and then they said, oh no, wait, we need some help. Will you please come in and help us? Oh yeah, I'll come in and help you, and here's some land because I got it back, and I'll just give it to you instead of giving it to the empire, right? Pippin and all of that happened, right? So that's sort of the feel of what's happening, and it's all about this feudal system. So Pippin was basically a lord, and the bishops were basically fiefs, and they were saying, please help us. And so the Lord comes in and says, sure, comes in, takes things over, pushes out the people that had come in and invaded, and then they have this relationship with each other, right? It's a weird relationship, but they have, at this point, a good relationship with each other, right? So the one thing that I want you to understand, at least as far as the church is concerned, the thing that feudalism did to the church was it really created this church-state relationship where the government, now Constantine really started it. Constantine got right into the church, but for the most part, he let the church govern itself. He would only come in whenever the church was misbehaving, or he didn't like that they were fighting, or whatever. But for the most part, he let the church be the church, and he was the government, right? But now with this feudal system that has developed, you've got a symbiotic relationship where the government's staying out of it, but the church needs help because of just the political, for example, the political nature of the time. They need help, they ask for help, so the help comes in, and then they become grateful, they become closer. They want to help each other. They want to continue. The church is going to want to continue to help the person that came in and gave them this land, for example. Do you know what I mean? It becomes more of a relationship rather than a hierarchy of, I'm the emperor and you're the bishop kind of thing. They started meshing a little bit. Lines were blurring. And remember, we talked about with Constantine that he started this idea of the secularization of the church, but it wasn't because of the government he was using. It's not because of this, like what we're seeing now. The secularization of the church was more about that heavy persecution that was all over the church, and then all of a sudden it was lifted, and then it was made, oh yeah, Christianity is now a legal religion, and now everybody comes in, even people who don't care about Christ, and it watered the church down. So that's secularization of the church. This is a little bit different. There is some secularization happening here, but it's not because people are flooding in for their own benefit. It's more because the government, the line between what is government and what is church is becoming watercolory and starting to blur together, right? So an example of this feudalistic system, we've kind of talked about kind of talked about a little example last time. I'm going to give you a more concrete example this time. Is this man Hildebrand. He became known as Pope Gregory VII. So in a time when feudalism is high and the church and the state are very much equal, so to speak, right? They think of each other as equals. Hildebrand comes along, or Pope Gregory comes along, and he says the church and the state are not equal. The church always trumps the state. Like that was his stance, right? Well, because that was his stance, the emperor at the time, this Henry IV, he doesn't really appreciate that very much, and there's some contention that kind of rises between the two of them. And Gregory accuses Henry of simony. Simony is a term that means buying or selling ecclesiastical seats. So what that means basically is like, especially through family relationships. So if Henry has a nephew who also happens to be a priest or has gone to, or is in a monastery, and he really wants to be the abbot of this or that, then Henry makes it happen, right? He buys it, or sometimes he will sell a position to get somebody out to bring somebody else in, right? So he's controlling on some level, not 100%, but on some level, when he wants, he can control who's working where, right?
Money.
Right. So the simony, and actually simony still happens. People are still accused of that. You know, it's not what you know, it's who you know kind of thing. And sometimes that's true because who you know just gets your foot in the door, but sometimes it's true because who you know can just get you in the door, and maybe that's not the place for you. Whatever. Anyway, so Henry gets accused of behaving this way, which I have no proof that he did. I haven't read anything that he did, but I haven't read a lot about him. So it wouldn't surprise me if he is guilty of that. So he's accused of simony, and Gregory says, Henry, I want you to come to Rome, and I want us to discuss the charges that I've brought against you, right? Well, Henry is not really, he doesn't really care. He's like, whatever, I'm not going to Rome. And he says, instead, what he decides to do is he calls a gathering or a synod. He calls this gathering of German bishops and basically calls them together and says, which by the way sounds a lot like simony, but whatever. He calls a bunch of people, he just didn't give them a title, but still he's controlling it based on his authority. But anyway, he calls in these German bishops, and they decide Gregory is not fit to be pope. They decide, oh no, he's crazy, whatever. Is it because of this? Probably. Anyway, so Gregory's not fit to be pope. Well, Gregory says, but I am the pope.
Yeah, too bad.
I mean, that's just the way it is. And so he excommunicates Henry. Well, I don't know how long the time frame was between the excommunication and when Henry asks for forgiveness, but my understanding is that Henry stood in the snow for 3 days begging forgiveness, which Gregory granted him. Now, in doing so, the outcome, the way that this worked, was another step toward the church beginning to claim papal supremacy. That kind of started with Leo, right? Gregory, not so much. He wasn't really so much into that. But this, the way, again, it was just like Theodosius. He got himself in trouble, did some things he shouldn't have done. Ambrose, smacked him, and he said he didn't care, but 8 months later he cared. And so much of that was because, remember, that so what the church believed at that time was that without communion, there is no salvation. And without baptism, there is no salvation. So when you read about these guys like Constantine, they wait until the very end of their life. Like they're lucky they know when their end of their life is coming. They wait till the very end of their life, and then they get baptized right before they die, because they believe they need it for salvation, right? So whenever Gregory, and remember, this was a time when people were, yes, they wanted to be part of the church. It was important to them. Even the governors, like starting with Constantine and running through, being part and member of the church was very important. And so excommunication was a big deal. He cared because of his eternity. he really didn't care too much for Gregory and didn't really care too much for, the person or whatever. And so he's like, whatever, you're not fit to be Pope anyway. But his authority trumped this synod, and he ended up asking for forgiveness and being let back into the church. So that's sort of, I know, sorry. I knew I was going to get me in trouble, but anyway. So does that kind of make a little bit of sense? Hopefully, when you read other things and you hear about feudalism, because the book sort of just mentions it real briefly, and in future chapters they'll just say the feudalist state or the feudalist leader or the this or the that, and you're like, what is that? If you have some idea of what that means, it might help you understand why they even told you that. Most of the time they're telling you it's a feudalistic system so that you can understand what they're about to tell you, how it plays in, right? Okay, so that is Mr. Hildebrand. That was that. All right, so we're going to spend the rest of the time. This is a very sensitive subject for most Christians, regardless of the denomination that you choose. We are going to spend the most of the remainder of the evening, talking about the Crusades. The Crusades. Let me make sure I spell it right, you guys. S-A-D-E-S. With the Crusades. These were known as armed pilgrimages. They spanned from 1095 to 1291. I'm not going to test you over this date. This is simply to give you a basis, like a timeline, right? I'm not going to ask you that date, though. These crusades, many of them began and ended in France. Just as a little side note. There were 7 major being the key word here, crusades. There were actually more that, depending on the source that you look, that you're reading, sometimes they'll say, this event happened, started by this leader, and it was called the Ninth Crusade. I don't know if that means that it's not universally recognized that way. If it is, sort of is wishy-washy about it. Anyway, whatever. There are 7 major crusades that you can count on. The other ones, I don't know. All right, so there was a man. His name was Peter the Hermit. Peter the Hermit. Okay. This guy he led a crusade. It's not a major crusade. It's within the Crusades, called the People's Crusade. Okay, and within this, he wrote a book actually about it too, but or there is a book written about it. So basically, what this guy did was he saw, and we're going to wrap around this in a minute. It's going to seem random right now, but he saw the Jewish people that were in the land, so the non-Christian who happened to be Jewish as well, he saw them as being enemies of Christ. Okay? This is all dating back to that idea that it was the Jewish people who crucified Jesus. Let's just not even go to the place where the Messiah had to die. I mean, somebody had to do it. I'm not sure why we're so hard on the Jewish people about it. But anyway, they saw the Jewish people as enemies of Christ in their own land, and they sought to finance an expedition that would take the money from them, and they would. It wasn't an expedition of destruction, as in destroy the Jewish people, but it was an expedition to remove them from the Christian nation, so to speak. Okay? These guys, they left total destruction in their wake. Eventually, the Turks came along, the Ottoman Turks. Those are some of the Muslim people. They came along and they wiped out Peter the Hermit and all of his people that were following in this People's Crusade. That's just this is a side note, this Peter the Hermit and his crusades. There was also another minor crusade called the Crusade of the Children. Apparently, there's a little bit of varying information out there, but apparently this was begun by a 12-year-old boy. He took a bunch of kids around his age, between 8 and 12, and they decided that they were going to go to Europe. They were going to walk to Europe. They're in France. They're going to walk to Europe, and they're going to join the Crusades, and they are going to they're going to join in the fighting. Many of those children died on the way. Many of them were captured and put into slavery. It was just a real bad deal. All right, so why was all of this happening? What started this idea of the Crusades? So people like Peter the Hermit, people like this 12-year-old kid, where did the excitement or the desire, the need to do this, where did it come from? All right, so all of this is basically in response to Muslim invasion, okay? We're going to loop back around to the Jewish people in a minute. The Muslims had come in and they had taken over they had taken over some of the territory. In particular, what started this first crusade was they had gone in and taken control of Jerusalem. Okay? Everybody was involved in understanding what it meant that Jerusalem no longer belonged to the Roman Empire or the Christian nation, or whatever title you want to put on top of it. As a response to losing Jerusalem, there is the Pope at the time was Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II. All right. So what he did was he gathered people together, and he was talking and trying to explain and stimulate acceptance and excitement for going and taking Jerusalem back, right? It was all about getting Jerusalem back. So all of the families and the communities were involved, the priests were involved, the monasteries were involved, the leadership, the abbots were involved, everybody. People in the prisons wanted to be involved, people who were homeless and starving and jobless, and everyone who could mentally understand what was happening. Everybody wanted to be involved in this because of the threat to Jerusalem. So what he did was he gathered a bunch of people together, and he's sort of just piquing interest, and he's talking about how it's our responsibility. We need to go and we need to get Jerusalem back from the Muslims. We need to take Jerusalem back. And the people were very excited, and they totally wanted to get involved with it. So there were people like Christians that were taking pilgrimages from one city to another. They were being attacked by the Muslims. That was getting back to these main cities. the emperor at Constantinople at this time, the Turks had come into Constantinople. He was asking and sending for help at this time. Pope Urban II was very excited because this was an opportunity, with Constantinople asking for help, this was an opportunity that perhaps we could start reuniting the East and the West churches again. So he was excited because there was this potential for uniting, or at least they were both fighting on the same front now instead of fighting against each other. So Pope Urban II needed to make joining the crusade something that people wanted to do. The just wanted because they loved Jerusalem or whatever. He wanted to give them incentive to join the Crusades. During this is kind of important. During this meeting that I'm talking about, the people began to shout the phrase, "God wills it." It became the mantra of the First Crusade. God wills it. This is what God wants us to do. We are being led by God to do these things, right? All right. So, this motivation, this is really where I'm going with this. This motivation to become a crusader or join the Crusades. The papacy declared two things. The papacy was willing to give special indulgence. We'll explain what that is in just a second. And the second thing they offered were exemptions. Okay? Special indulgence, this is a spiritual blessing. This is a civil blessing. Okay? All right. So this special indulgence, this spiritual blessing. All right, for those who would willingly volunteer to fight, their confessed sins would be forgiven, whether in this life or by shortening the sentence in purgatory. Okay, so what he was offering the people were, all right, if you're willing to become a crusader, then the sin you confess, you will be permanently forgiven. And if not in this life, in the next. All right? This idea of indulgence is very important. It's going to come up again later on. This is sort of where that term begins. This idea of, if you do this, then you will get that. And it's dictated by the church. Okay? It's not necessarily dictated by Scripture, it's dictated by the church. All right? The second thing under this spiritual motivator is that there would be, for the person who went and fought in the Crusades, no more penance ever. You would never have to do penance again. So the people were pretty excited. But then you had people who were not able to be a crusader. Very old people, women in some societies, some areas, children, just people who just did not qualify to make, a trek of, and then be able to fight when they get to the end of it, right? So there was accommodation made for those. For those who could not go on an actual crusade, you could earn these same spiritual rewards if, for example, if you're a parent and you sent your child, you would receive a reward. If you have some sort of wealth, say you're a ship owner and you give ships to, or some sort of travel, not a lot of water in some places, but you know what I'm saying, it's in general, or money, something that would help move the crusade along, right? So if you were somebody who contributed, even if you didn't participate, you would be granted these privileges. Okay? People were highly motivated. So you had the first idea that somebody took Jerusalem, which freaks everybody out, but then you have all of these privileges that will come on top of taking this risk and going out and becoming a crusader. All right. There was a French chronicler, I don't know who it is, who wrote about this first crusade, and what he said was, God invented the Crusades as a new way for the laity to atone for their sins. That's a big statement. So at this point, there's a major difference. You have the clergy and you have the laity, and they have very different titles, right? I mean, the clergy is way up here and the laity are down here, right? And what this guy said is, God invented the Crusades as a way for the laity to atone for their sins. I mean, it was a time when privilege was given to people who would otherwise not get that privilege. Okay? All right. So, the civil exemptions, those are a little bit more concrete. They were people who went on crusades. They were free from paying taxes, ever, paying interest on loans. All of their debts were forgiven. Yeah. And for those who had been prosecuted, those who were felons, basically, they would be relieved of their criminal record for any atrocity that would have been committed prior to the crusade.
They were what?
I'm sorry?
They were who?
These are people who had been convicted of a crime. So like prisoners or people who had been let out of prison. But once you were marked, and that's still sort of true today, once you get out of prison, it's difficult to re-enter society, really. And
They were forgiven, though.
and they were forgiven. So these people, they would lose everything. They would lose their ability to own a business, contribute to a business, have a job, go to, be represented in court, be a representer in court. I mean, they lost everything. So then when they got out of prison, I don't know this for sure, but I don't think they got it back because of their record. But if it's expunged, they just join society again, right? So it was a big deal. Now, at the time that this first crusade happened, the Muslim armies were a little bit divided. They were weakened. It's kind of in the same vein as what happened with Attila the Hun when he showed up at Rome. Like nobody knew that everyone was sick and dying and getting, tired of conquering everybody and killing everybody, and Leo goes out there and Attila's like, okay, sure. And everyone's like, Leo, you're so great. Well, this first crusade, whenever the Christians got to Jerusalem, the armies were a little bit weakened. They were a little bit at a disadvantage for whatever reason. They just weren't fully functioning. So when that crusade hit, they were successful. This first crusade was the most successful crusade of all of them. And if I remember correctly, which I may not be, but if I remember correctly, I don't believe any of the other ones were successful. They had some measure of success on some level, but it was quickly lost. This first crusade was the big one. Okay? Now, a lot of people, or let's put it this way, you might imagine that many people who were the most highly motivated were of the lowest class and the most questionable morals. Like whenever you're offering to allow a career criminal all of these privileges, they may or may not have any interest in the reason that they're going to fight. I mean, quite frankly, some of them may have been looking forward just to fighting. I mean, who knows, right? So there were a fair number of people who went on the crusade who were doing things that weren't necessarily what Pope Urban II expected them to do. Okay, I'll talk a little bit more about it. So basically, what these guys did whenever they entered into Jerusalem, there was kind of they have to walk all the way across the country and then down into Jerusalem. And I think there was another set that went across the sea and came into Jerusalem that way. But anyway, when they finally got into Jerusalem, they took the city, and as they went through, they did not necessarily make a distinction between the Muslims and the Jewish people who lived in Jerusalem. Okay? They went through and treated everybody the same. They were very harsh and very awful to the civilian people that lived in Jerusalem. Many people believe that the major reason that happened was because the quality, so to speak, of the people who were in that crusade, they weren't really there to take Jerusalem back in the name of God. They were there to get all of these special privileges and have a little fun while they're at it. I mean, this may, that's what a lot of people believe about the people who committed the largest atrocities during this first crusade. Now, it wasn't just Jerusalem. As they were coming across the nation, especially, there was like a little cluster real close to where they left in France, the city that they left. There was this like cluster of areas, different cities where they were mainly Jewish cities, and they just decimated them. They just did terrible things to the Jewish people and kind of left a bloody trail in their wake that, especially by our standards, when as a society now, whether you're secular or whether you're not, looking back on that behavior, there's really no defense for it. That is not, whenever Urban sent them out, he did not send them out, to my understanding, he did not send them out and say, kill everybody you find. I mean, this was a spiritual pilgrimage. This was to regain Christian land that had been lost to the Muslims. That's it, right? And somehow the Jewish people got caught up in this in a big way. And one of the things I wanted to share with you, I looked at a few sites, and I can't remember the search that I did. It was, maybe it was just timeline of the Crusades or something like that. I just did a quick search and I found several sites, and I just picked a couple that I found. So in one of them, at this time frame, they call it the Crusader period, and they just say, first Crusaders captured Jerusalem. That's all that's said. This website happens to be, I'm pretty sure this is a jewishvirtuallibrary.org. Okay, so this is a Jewish-based website, and all they have to say about the Crusader period is first Crusaders captured Jerusalem, and they just kind of give this super brief overview. Another site, this is also a Jewish-based site. It says, so we're going to back up a little bit from this time frame. So back in 312, this would have been about the time of Constantine. That's when he took over power. This is how they describe that. It says, 312, Christianity expels Jews from Jerusalem. The Christians ruled Israel for 300 years and made it illegal for Jews to live in Jerusalem. That's okay. A little bit later, 638. The Muslims conquered Jerusalem. The Muslims conquered Israel and Jerusalem. Though they allowed Jews to move back into Jerusalem, they also built their mosque atop Judaism's holiest site, the Temple Mount. Okay? Then they jumped to the area of 1099. This is the year that they said, Christians return to Jerusalem. The Christians defeat the Muslims and kill all the Jews in Jerusalem.
All the Jews, but not the Muslims, right?
Well, defeat the Muslims and kill all the Jews. Yeah, that does make it sound. So, now, I am not saying that this minimal view or this not so minimal view, I'm not saying either of them are correct or incorrect. What I'm telling you is the tainting that the Crusades put on the Christian church is heavy, and it's well deserved. I mean, this is that's why it's so controversial. People have a very difficult time. If you really start reading into the Crusades and you start learning about some of the stuff that happened, it's not your run-of-the-mill corruption. We're talking about just what is described, like this second website, what is just described as bloodthirsty people in the name of Christ wiping people out everywhere they go. Now, in some way, in some vein, there's some truth to that. Is that the complete truth? Probably not. But it's truth enough that the church, this is a huge blemish on the church at large. The Crusades are not something most people won't speak for everybody, but I would venture to guess that most Christians do not look at the time of the Crusades and go, woohoo! Right? We alienated ourselves. I mean, and I haven't read a whole lot about it, so who knows if my view is going to change at some point. But to my opinion, just the sheer destruction that was done between the Christians and the Muslims and the Christians and the Jewish people, I mean, it's irreparable because it's been how long? I mean, we're now in 2017, and that is a current website. I mean, it's a really awful time in our history. Anyway, so let me read a little bit. I have a couple of quotes here. So that's basically the First Crusade. The Second Crusade, I'm just going to read a little bit about it. The Second Crusade was initiated by a pope named Eugenius III. Again, it was to fight the Muslims. The Muslim armies were no longer disorganized, no longer weak, and there were really no victories to speak of from the Second Crusade. There was a man named Bernard of Clairvaux, and he wrote this about this crusade. He said, "Pagans must not be slain. Pagans must not be slain. They may by other means be prevented from oppressing the faithful. However, it is better that they should be put to death than that the rod of the wicked should rest on the lot of the righteous. The righteous fear no sin in killing the enemy of Christ. Christ's soldiers can securely kill and more safely die. When he dies, it profits him. When he slays, it profits Christ. The Christian exalts the death of the pagan because Christ is glorified thereby. But when he himself is killed, he has reached his goal." That is the attitude of the Crusades. And that is why the secular world, or even other religions, especially those that were involved in it, look at this time period and go, there's no way. I mean, it's a deal breaker. Christianity becomes a deal breaker. Let's see. By the end of the Third Crusade, the attitude started to change a little bit in general. It became apparent to us, the Christian communities, it became apparent that violence does not convert. And that was basically what had been used in the first three crusades, violence to conversion. And what they started realizing is that while violence doesn't convert, a slow moral persuasion or spreading of the gospel will convert. All right, so the other crusades, there's one more that I want to talk about. So this first crusade was started by Urban II. This was the slogan, "God wills it." And it was successful in taking Jerusalem back. So those are the highlights. The lowlights or bad points are that many people who were otherwise not involved in this conflict were also caught up and affected. It's also important to know that these spiritual and civil privileges were given to those who were willing to go and fight in the Crusades. All right. Now, I want to move. So this was during the time of the Crusades. I want to move to a different pope. This is definitely one I want you to know. He's important. His name is Pope Innocent III. What's unique about him right from the start is that he was not a monk. He was the first pope, to my knowledge, he was the first pope who was given the position who was not previously a monk. He was a canon or biblical lawyer. Okay? Very, very bright. Knew the scripture, knew the law, knew the scripture in order to delegate and dictate the law. He became Pope. His time, just as a reference, I won't ask you this, but just as a reference, 1198 to 1216.
So he wasn't a priest or anything?
Nope, he was a lawyer, and he was given this position, or elected into, or drug out of the wood. No, I'm just kidding. He became Pope. I don't know. I actually don't know the story behind how that happened, but he became Pope. Now, he was much more interested in the law than he was in, for example, the love that Gregory had started, the love of the people, the good of the people. Not to say that he didn't have the good of the people in mind. He wasn't a tyrant. I mean, he's not totally awful. But his love was the law. And that's what he did with his life prior to becoming Pope. So he began to really establish and put into place this idea of papal authority. It had been sort of given by the public before because of the actions and the attitudes. Leo saved Rome twice. Gregory, he was making all these deals with the emperors at the time and gaining land and making sure the people get fed. And he was really working for the people. Innocent was not necessarily working in those same ways, but he had the understanding that the title and the position of the Pope had ultimate authority, not just over the church, but he, of course, believed over the empire. All right. He began the idea of papal authority. He began with those papal states. After he was put into this position, he began with the papal states and the people who were running churches in those different states within that it's not a little sliver of land, but that area, 1,800 square miles or whatever it was. And once he had kind of gained control over that area, he began to reach out, and he began to go out into the empire and kind of reach out beyond the church's boundaries, okay? So he had two primary methods to control, okay? He used two things to control the people. And he used them big time. First was excommunication, which other bishops had used as well. I mean, it's not a new concept. This is removal of an individual from the church, okay? What he began to realize is that if he was dealing with a governor who was not necessarily a Christian, who was not into it, right? This did not work on somebody who was not afraid to die without baptism and without communion, right? And it began mostly with those that were in control of some of the cities in the government, in the empire, okay? Whenever this tool didn't work, he introduced what is known as an interdict. This is the removal of an entire country. All right? So what would happen is he would call on King, who's-he, what's-its, and say, I want you to pay taxes to the church. I want you to pay your people to pay a 5% tax to the church. I'm totally making this up, obviously. All right, so this king kind of looks at him and, I don't think so. I don't think we're going to pay the church that. We already give, whatever, right? We're not going to give anything else. And he says, okay, well, I'm going to excommunicate you. And he says, okay, I'm good with that. I'm all right. Well, so then he says, all right, well, if you won't play, I'm going to deliver an interdict, and the entire country of, for example, Germany, They're all excommunicated because of you. All right. Now, if you get an entire country of people who do believe they need communion and baptism in order to be saved, and their leader is saying, I don't care, they can just excommunicate us. Oh, buddy, that does not work. And the people got freaked out, and they were not having it. And so it became something where the difficulties that were brought on by the people well outweighed this, in this case, 5% tax that Innocent was asking to come to the church, right? So this interdict became an exceptionally powerful tool. As long as the people that the king or the emperor or whoever was governing were Christian, he had them. Yeah. Okay? All right. So whenever this interdict was put into place, what he would tell all the churches in that country, no communion, no baptisms, no meeting, no meeting as the church, no sacraments, nothing. Basically close your doors, you're done. Right. And so because those bishops were under his authority, they did it. And the people were just like totally freaking out. It was not good. So, Innocent, he started the Fourth Crusade. I'm not going to test you on that, but he did. He initiated the Fourth Crusade. There's a lot that goes into it. It deals a lot with Constantinople and the Venetians, and I might be able to get into it next week a little bit, but we don't have time for me to tell that story right now. So, what I really want you to know about Innocent, the reason that he's so important is because he is yet another building block, another stepping stone in our understanding about how the church became what it was at that time. So there was political unrest. There was this splitting of the churches. There was this discontent between the churches. Then the nation got Christianized. And then everybody started coming in, and we still had to deal with, and then the Muslims come in and they start taking everything over. And while all this is happening, the Pope, whether it's Innocent or, a previous Pope, their whole goal is to try to, some of them, to unify the churches. Sometimes find a way to unify the churches. It was the first time that the churches had a solid front where they were actually in unity and fighting against the same cause. It was a big deal. But with Innocent, what he did was he took this idea of indulgence that kind of started with the First Crusade, this idea of if you do this or offer this or give this or whatever, if you fill in the blank, then your spiritual reward will be this. Innocent took that to a whole new level, and he began basically to take money for example, if my husband died and I thought that he might be in purgatory, one of the ways to shorten that sentence is to have the Mass, right? Have a Mass specifically for him. Well, he began to charge for those Masses. And if you didn't have the money, you didn't get it. That was it. And this is leaping forward just a little bit, but when you get to Martin Luther and the Reformation, one of his key questions to the church at the time, because it kind of started back here with the First Crusade, and then he really solidified this idea of the indulgence. They were going around the country at the time of the Reformation, right before it started. They were going around the country, and they were actually soliciting money. And what they were soliciting the money for was it's not like it was a secret. They were building a huge church, and they needed money to finish it. I think it was even St. Peter's. But anyway, the Basilica. But anyway, so they're collecting money to do all this, but they are offering, in order, if you give this money, lifetime indulgence, lifetime no penance, lifetime no purgatory, or after death no purgatory, et cetera, et cetera. People were lining up down the streets to pay. Paying for Masses so that you can shorten the times of purgatory. And it was interesting because if at that time, if I understand, if a pope or a bishop or whoever was asked, how do we know if the Mass worked? How do we know when our loved one goes from purgatory into heaven? Or, you know what I mean? Just questions like that. The simple answer is nobody knows. But by faith, you continue to do these things so that you can help your loved ones, right? So there were special penances. This has nothing to do with innocent, but there were special penances for climbing, and I actually think it's still true today, climbing the steps to St. Peter's Cathedral. And I mean, there's all kinds of things like that are still going on today. And so that's not a money issue, though. Anyway, so Innocent basically exploited the idea of the indulgent and the spiritual benefit. And the danger here is, I mean, people can have the best interest. Like you can want very much to shorten somebody's sentence in purgatory or to grant them a lifetime without penance. And I mean, those are things that you want to give somebody to lift a burden. The problem is, or the question comes in, where or at what point was that sort of authority given to a person, whether it's a pope or a bishop or a this or a that? And that's where the real question comes in. Under what scriptural authority does a person have the right to say, I'm going to shorten this sentence. I'm going to grant these things to you. And that's where Innocent got a little bit crazy. He was very much willing to take that responsibility and say that he would do all of these things for the people, and they loved it. Like, they were all about it. They wanted all those privileges. All right, so that's Innocent. We will talk more about him in the future. He'll come back into play. So now, see, it's going to be a normal lecture. It's not a short lecture. All right. So, all right. There were two primary reasons for the Crusades. Okay? In their conception. One was to reclaim the Holy Land. And the second was to reunite the Greek and Latin churches. That was the whole goal of the Crusades, all of them. And by those standards, the Crusades were a complete and total failure. The church remained divided, and the Christians were not successful in taking back their land. So all of those years of fighting, all of the bloodshed, all of the crazy, we never accomplished the mission that we set out to accomplish. And actually, even worse, we very seriously, if not permanently, since it's still happening now, it's still an issue now, damaged relationships, especially with the Jews, but with any non-Christian group. I mean, even the secular people that have no interest in one religion over another, they look at this, and because this was a spiritual pilgrimage, this was a church-based initiative, this was started by our fathers, it did a number on on us. I mean, we can't take it back, we can't make it better, we can apologize for it, but we just have a tainted history because of the Crusades. Let's see, we talked about that. I think I'm going to skip the rest of this. Yep. I am going to pick up with a little bit after. I'm going to pick up next time with Innocent right after he dies. This is a preview. So while he was controlling the papacy, he made an order or a declaration that no new monasteries were to be started, like nothing new was to start. And because it was too expensive, we had other things that we were spending our money on, so don't spend money on monasteries, building new monasteries. And so as soon as he died, the very same year he died, that's when the Dominican monasteries were formed, and within just a few years, the Franciscan monasteries were formed, right after he passed away. So this is very simplistic and may not even be accurate, but when you tell somebody, I don't want you to do this anymore, the second they're not there, here they come. That's what it looks like. I mean, if you just look at it from like the, balloon fiesta view on things, it's like, wow, you've got to stop telling people not to do stuff, but yeah. So anyway, we'll talk a little bit about the Dominicans and the Franciscans. They play a part in the next part that we're going to talk about, but we'll talk about it next time. All right, everybody. Thank you for being here. And, homework. Your homework for this week is,
21 and 22.
Yes, ma'am. Chapters 21 and 22. You are correct. And just so you know, we will meet next week and the week after. And then on December 18th, we will have test number 2. And then we'll have 2 weeks off. And remember to be reading Fox's Book of Martyrs. And that 1-page opinion paper is due on January 8th when we come back from break.
So you're going to give us a review
Yes.
the week before?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'll give you, I don't know if I'll give you a formal review up here, but I'll definitely give you pages to be able to.
Like we did the last time?
Yes. If I have time for a review, then I will do that as well. Okay? All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a good week. And hopefully I will be able to see everybody next week.